Okay, so the next thing that we're going to talk about is the cerebrum. And the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain. If we look at this figure over here, first of all, here we have the cerebellum. Here we have the brainstem. And then on top of the brainstem is the diencephalon region, the thalamus and the hypothalamus and whatnot. But then everything surrounding that, all of this area right there, represents the cerebrum. So the cerebrum is most definitely the largest part of the brain. Okay, now back to this figure here, what you can see is that we can divide the cerebrum into two cerebral hemispheres. That's the right cerebral hemisphere. This is a superior view. This is the left cerebral hemisphere. And then they're separated by this deep crease that we call the longitudinal fissure. Now, something that you can imagine is that these cerebral hemispheres need to communicate. And how can they communicate if they have this, they're separated by this big, deep longitudinal fissure? And the answer is over here. This is a frontal section of the brain, and you can see the longitudinal fissure there separating the hemispheres. But then you have this band of tissue right there that it's nervous tissue that connects the two cerebral hemispheres, and this is called the corpus callosum. And this is going to allow those two cerebral hemispheres to communicate. And when we look at the sheep brains in the lab, what you can do is you can take these two cerebral hemispheres and peel them apart from each other, and you'll see that they are separated until you get down there deep enough, down to about right there, and you'll see a band of tissue that's running between those and connecting them, and that's the corpus callosum. All right, so we can divide each cerebral hemisphere into three different regions. And the first region is the cerebral cortex. Now, cortex is a term that we see in with anatomy quite a bit, the adrenal cortex, the renal cortex, and all cortex means is bark or outer layer. So the cerebral cortex is the outer layer of the cerebrum here. And as you can see, it's composed of gray matter. Now, the reason it's gray, if this is a neuron, remember the brain is composed of billions and billions of neurons. The reason it's gray is because we have collections of nerve cell bodies located up there in that cerebral cortex. So the portion of the neurons that we find up there in the cerebral cortex are these nerve cell bodies. Now, the cerebral cortex is super important. And the reason that's the case is because this is where our thinking occurs. This is where our conscious integration occurs, is up here in the cerebral cortex. All this sensory information goes up to the cerebral cortex, but we don't become aware of it until it actually hits this region. It hits those cell bodies there. All right, the next part of each cerebral hemisphere is the internal white matter. I'll do this in blue. So as you can see, this is all white matter there. And what is white matter? So here we have a neuron, and like I mentioned, the gray area up here is the nerve cell body. Well, all of the white matter are the axon portions of neurons. And so the way I like to think of it is that you have all these neurons, use a different color, you have all these neurons traveling up there, and in the white matter specifically, you have the axons portions. And so these axons are taking electrical information up towards the cerebral cortex. Okay, so the white matter are kind of the freeways, those are the axons, and then what happens is that, let's see, is that they release neurotransmitters onto the cell bodies in the cerebral cortex. And when those axon terminals release neurotransmitters onto those cell bodies, that's when thinking happens. That's where integration happens. And so the cerebral cortex is where all the action's at, and then this white matter just represents axons basically taking all that information, all that sensory information up to the cerebral cortex to be processed. Now there is a third region of the cerebral hemispheres, and we're not going to talk so much about these, but these are called basal ganglia or basal nuclei. And what these are islands of gray matter that are situated deep within the white matter. And there's three of them. There's the caudate nucleus, the globus pallidus or pallidus, not quite sure, and also the putamen there. And if we look at this frontal section there, anterior view, we can see those. There's a little bit of gray matter. That's the caudate nucleus. Here's another little bit of gray matter. That's the putamen. And here's another bit of gray matter. That's the globus pallidus right there. So you have these little islands of gray matter situated deep within the white matter. And what are these involved in? Well, first of all, they're all called the basal ganglia. But what are they involved in? They're primarily involved in motor control. So skeletal muscle control. Okay, including motor learning, so muscle memory and stuff like that is what these basal ganglia are involved in. And I'll give you a quick example of that. Huntington's disease is a nervous system disease. It's an inherited condition, and basically what happens is the nerve cells in the basal ganglia over time start to break down. And you can hear these are the basal ganglia, and what happens is they start to break down, and then what happens because of that is the ventricles become enlarged because of it. So people with Huntington's disease tend to have these large ventricles because the basal ganglia on either side of them started to break down. So what happens? What are the symptoms of Huntington's disease? Well, there's a lot of muscular symptoms. Abnormality walking, increased muscle activity, involuntary movements, problems with coordination, loss of muscle control, muscle spasms. So all of this kind of skeletal muscle control that the basal ganglia are involved in become affected if they start to break down. All right, so one thing you may have noticed is that the surface of the cerebrum, the cerebral cortex itself, it's not flat, but instead it has ridges to it. It has valleys to it. Okay, and so there's some terminology here that we need to look at, and this is a good one to do. This is a frontal section of the brain, and this is an anterior view. And first of all, you have these ridges that we call gyri. Gyri is plural, gyrus is singular. So that's a gyrus. That's a gyrus. That's another one. These are all gyri right there. But the gyri are separated by these valleys or by these shallow grooves that we call sulci. Sulci is plural, sulcus is singular. So there's a sulcus. There's a sulcus. There's another sulcus. Okay? So instead of the cerebral cortex being flat, it's thrown into these folds, into these gyri, and into these sulci. And why is that the case? Why is that advantageous? Or what's the benefit of, instead of having a flat cerebral cortex, having it thrown into all these different valleys and ridges? Well, anytime you see something in the body that folds in on itself or has a projection or anything like that, one of the primary reasons that's the case is to increase surface area. And if the cerebral cortex is involved in all this conscious thinking and processing and integration then if we increase that surface area, then we greatly increase our processing ability. And humans are really special with this regard. We can just process and integrate so much, and that's due to all this surface area in the cerebral cortex. There's one other term that I want to throw out. So sulci are shallow grooves, but if you have a deep sulcus, then that's called a fissure. And where did we just see a fissure? Right there. Okay, that's the longitudinal fissure. So you can see it's much deeper than a sulcus. And there you have that corpus callosum that's connecting the two cerebral hemispheres. It is worth looking at this diagram right here, because these are things you're going to have to know in the lab. But there is a sulcus that runs right down the middle of the brain for the most part, called the central sulcus, and that separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. And then on either side of it, there are gyri. So up here in the up here anterior to the central sulcus is the precentral gyrus. And this is called specifically the primary motor cortex. And that's going to be involved in generating skeletal muscle commands. And then posterior to the central sulcus is the postcentral gyrus. And this is where we find the primary sensory cortex. And that's where a lot of sensory information, specifically sensory information from the skin, is going to go to be processed. So we'll come back to those. Just to talk about this surface area just a little bit, not a lot of animals have this folding of the cerebral cortex. If you look at a rat, for instance, this is the cerebrum right there, and you can see that it's flat. Not a lot of processing ability, although they are smart. There's not a lot of folding going on in there. Here's a cat. There's a few folds in there, but it's pretty flat itself. Then you start getting into chimpanzees. Chimpanzees start to have more surface area in the cerebral cortex. And here we are, okay, humans. And as you can see, we have quite a few folds in there that really increases our processing ability. Then there's some other animals that have this same type of surface area. Look what's going on with the dolphin here. All of this folding going on in there. Killer whales are a type of dolphin. Really smart. Here we have an elephant. Look at all those folds going on there in the African elephant. So a lot of processing ability with elephants, humans, and dolphins, and chimpanzees. What this folding has really allowed for too is it's allowed for some really specialized areas of the brain, of the cerebral cortex, and one of those areas is called the prefrontal cortex. So first of all, this is all frontal lobe, and all of this area of the frontal lobe is pretty much involved in skeletal muscle control, but then you have this area up front in the anterior region, and this is called the prefrontal area, or the prefrontal cortex. Let's get you some better coloration there. Change it to blue. So this area up there, right at your forehead basically, is the prefrontal area, the prefrontal cortex. And there's a lot of really sophisticated things going on there. They call these executive functions, making big executive, big boss man or boss woman decisions. And so this is where a lot of, like, for instance, long-term planning happens. A lot of decision making happens in the prefrontal cortex. For instance, the ability to organize a trip or put together a plan to save money for a car. That kind of stuff happens in the prefrontal cortex up there. And it's also involved in personality expression and moderating social behavior. And something that's interesting about it is that it doesn't fully develop until about age 25. And so, that's one of the many reasons why, alcohol and marijuana and stuff is not good for children. Well, adults too, but especially for children's and young adults, pretty much up until age 25, is because these types of drugs affect the prefrontal cortex, and they can affect, that long-term planning and decision-making ability. And a classic example of, the prefrontal cortex is this guy right there. His name is Phineas Gage, and I think this was like in the early 1900s or whatnot, but he took a railroad spike straight through the skull, and it went right through that prefrontal cortex area. And, there was personality changes and social behavior changes that were related to that. Okay, so if we look at the cerebrum here and the cerebral cortex, we can divide each hemisphere into 5 lobes, and these lobes are all separated by sulci. And so up here we have the frontal lobe, And the frontal lobe has the prefrontal cortex that we talked about. It also has the primary motor cortex. That primary motor cortex is located right there. Okay, right there up on the precentral gyrus. And this is where the conscious control of skeletal muscle commands is going to come from. And when we get back to skeletal muscles, we'll talk about that. That's going to be the last topic we talk about in this class. Another lobe of the brain is the parietal lobe. This is the parietal lobe here. What happens in the parietal lobe? Well, something I should say is that, let's just go through all these lobes. We have the frontal lobe. Here we have the parietal lobe. Here we have the occipital lobe. Here we have the temporal lobe. And then there's a fifth lobe, which you can't really see. You have to peel apart the frontal and the temporal lobe, and that's called the insula. Now, the frontal lobe, like I just mentioned, has the prefrontal cortex, and it's involved in the control of skeletal muscle command. But all of these other lobes, the parietal, occipital, temporal lobe, and the insula, this is where the conscious integration of sensory information is going to occur. So sensory information that comes from different parts of the body is going to be taken up to these specific lobes, to the parietal lobe, occipital, temporal, and insula. And that's where that information, that sensory information, is going to be integrated. So let's start with the parietal lobe here. What type of sensory information is going to be integrated in the parietal lobe? Well, sensory information coming from the skin is going to travel up to the parietal lobe to be integrated. Temperature, touch, vibration, pain, all that stuff that comes from right underneath the epidermis is going to be sent up to the parietal lobe for integration. The occipital lobe. What type of sensory information is processed in the occipital lobe? This is where visual information is processed. And so information from the eye is going to come back and be processed in the occipital lobe here. What about the temporal lobe? This is where hearing and smell information is going to come. So we hear stuff in our ear, that information goes to the temporal lobe to be processed. We smell stuff, that goes to the temporal information to be processed. And then lastly, we have the insula, and this is where we have the primary taste cortex. This is where taste is going to be integrated. So you can see all of this different sensory information coming from different parts of the body goes to these lobes right there to be processed. Okay, and let's look at how that information gets there. So first of all, I guess one thing I just want to point out in here, the frontal lobe. Why is that called the frontal lobe? The parietal lobe. Why is that called the parietal lobe? Why is that the occipital lobe? Why is that the temporal lobe? You may not know this yet because we haven't got to the skeletal system yet, but all of these lobes those names correspond to the cranial bones that are right on top of them. So the cranial bone is on top of the frontal bone is on top of the frontal lobe. The parietal bone is on top of the parietal lobe. This is where the temporal bone is. This is where the occipital bone is. So the bones that over the top of them correspond to the lobes that are underneath them. Okay, again, let's look at how that sensory information gets to the cerebral cortex to be processed. So this right up here, this is the cerebral cortex, and this is our ultimate destination for it. Well, how does it get there? Okay, so right now we're looking at the foot, in the bottom of the foot, and specifically we're detecting temperature information to the bottom of the foot. So that's detected by this guy right there. What is that? That's a sensory receptor. This smudgy writing. Okay, that's a sensory receptor. And that sensory receptor is stimulated, and it takes that information through this spinal nerve, goes through the intervertebral foramen, and goes back here through the dorsal root route. And there's the dorsal root ganglion. And then that sensory information, where is it going? It's going to the spinal cord. So I know that's all pretty small down there, but again, this is sensory information that's coming from the skin of the foot. That information travels through the spinal nerve, through the dorsal root. There's the dorsal root ganglion with that cell body there. And then that information goes to the spinal cord. What level of the spinal cord is this information going to? It's going to the lumbar region of the spinal cord. The lumbar region of the spinal cord serves the lower limbs. But now we have to get that information up to the brain. So it synapses with another neuron in the spinal cord. And what type of neuron is this next neuron? It's an interneuron. All of these, now that we're in the spinal cord and the brain and the central nervous system, these are all interneurons that we're dealing with. And that interneuron sends that information all the way up the spinal cord, all the way up through the brainstem, and the next place it goes is the thalamus. And so there's the thalamus, and so it synapses with another neuron in the thalamus. And what does the thalamus do? The thalamus takes that sensory information and it directs it to the appropriate location in the cerebral cortex for processing. So how many neurons did that take to get from the sensory stimulus all the way up to the cerebral cortex? It only took 3 neurons to get there. Okay, so these neurons, some of these neurons have really long axons. Here's a sensory neuron, and then it took 2 interneurons to get it up to the cerebral cortex. Something else that's going on here that's worth noting. What's happening right there? Basically what's happening is the sensory information. Oh boy, what foot is that right there? This is the left foot. Hope that's right. Put my feet out like so. Yeah, okay. So this is the left foot here. So this is sensory information on the left side of the body, but when it gets in the spinal cord, it crosses over to the right part of the spinal cord. And then it's taken up and it's processed in the right cerebrum, in the right cerebral cortex. And so information on the left side of the body is processed on the right side of the brain, and information on the right side of the body is processed on the left side of the brain. And we call this decussation, when this information crosses over from one part of the central nervous system, the spinal cord, to another. We call that decussation. Okay, so now we're going to start looking at some specific examples here. And like I mentioned earlier, sensory information from the skin is going to go to the parietal lobe for processing. So it's going to go to the parietal lobe here. But the first place that it's going to go in the parietal lobe is this area on the postcentral gyrus there called the primary sensory cortex. So if this is the thalamus, and the thalamus receives this sensory information, the thalamus is going to send that sensory information coming from the skin specifically to the primary sensory cortex. And what happens when this information reaches the primary sensory cortex? This is where awareness happens. This is where we become aware of the stimuli. So here we have a situation where you have perhaps light touch receptors that are activated on the hand. And that information travels up these neurons to the thalamus, and the thalamus sends that information to the primary sensory cortex. And once that information, not before, but once that information reaches the primary sensory cortex, that's where we become aware of the stimuli. We do not feel this touch until that information hits the primary sensory cortex. if you had damage to that interneuron right there, or that interneuron right there, and that sensory information was not able to reach the primary sensory cortex, then you would not feel that. All of the sensory information, the sensory receptor, that would work, and the information would be trying to come up. But if it can't get up to the primary sensory cortex here, then you're not going to become aware of it. You would not feel it. Okay, so specifically though, awareness involves two different things. The first thing that awareness encompasses is actually feeling the stimulus. So you don't feel the stimulus until it hits that primary sensory cortex. But the other part of awareness is also knowing its location, where on the body that stimulus is occurring from. So once that information hits the primary sensory cortex, two things happen. One, you feel it, and two, you know where specifically on the body that's occurring. After that awareness occurs, then that information is sent over to this other area over here that's also part of the parietal lobe. And this is called the sensory association area, the somatic sensory association area. And when that information hits this area, the sensory association area, that's where we actually give meaning to the stimulus. So once that information hits that, we give meaning to it. Now, what does that mean? Well, this is where we think about it. This is where we put our thinking cap on. We link it to past events, for instance. Okay? So if you had this information that you became aware of, you feel light touch, for instance, coming from your right hand, then that information is sent to the association area. Now you apply meaning to it. What type of meaning might you apply here? Well, you may think of past events, and you may be like, well, all of this light touch feels like an insect. That could be an insect on my hand. Okay, so that's that. All of that kind of processing occurs in the association area. And the last thing that occurs in the association area after you apply meaning is you actually decide a response. So, all right, you've decided that this is probably an insect on your hand. What do you want to do about it? Okay, and that response that you decide is generated in that association area. And just to give you kind of what's a response that you might have to this situation here? Well, you may want to, smash the insect, get it off there. Or maybe you want to, shake your hand to get it off, something like that. Just to give you a little preview of what happens, after you've decided what to do, let's say you want to shake your hand to get it off, that information travels over to the frontal lobe that's involved in skeletal muscle contraction, and that's where those skeletal muscle commands actually are generated, and then they make their way down through the brain, through the spinal cord, and they synapse with a motor neuron that's going to cause the specific skeletal muscles to contract. So all of these steps, though, all of these specific steps, awareness, applying meaning, deciding a response, you guys have to be savvy about all that kind of stuff and to be able to know what that stuff means and apply it to different sensory situations. Okay, there's another little feature here that I want to talk about, and specifically what we're looking at here is not there, but up here. What we're looking at specifically is we're looking at the primary sensory cortex. So this is the primary sensory cortex right up there, and again, it's that band of tissue right back in back of the central sulcus. So this is where information goes, sensory information goes first, and this is where we become aware of it. And as you can see, there's different areas of the body that are represented on different areas of the primary sensory cortex. So for instance, this area of the primary sensory cortex is where it is associated with the foot. This part of the sensory cortex is associated with the head. This big, large region right there is associated with the hand and the fingers. This big, large area right there is associated with the face, the eyes, the nose, the face, the lips. Okay? So as you can see, different parts of the body have more representation than others. And if you were to basically make a person based on these proportions here, this is what it would look like. The hands are incredibly represented. The face has a lot of representation. But then the arms just have that little area right there. The legs just have these little spindly area right there, so they're not represented that much at all. So the question is, why are some areas of the body represented more than others? For instance, why do the fingers take up more space than the entire leg? And the answer to that is the amount of space taken up by each body part is based on the region's sensitivity. So the reason the hands have more representation is because the hands are incredibly sensitive. There's a whole lot more sensory information that's coming from the hands than other parts of the body, and it just requires more primary sensory cortex to deal with, is the answer to that. So if you can imagine this though, if this is the thalamus down here, and the thalamus, let's say sensory information is coming from the hand like that previous situation, then there's going to be an interneuron that goes from the thalamus to the specific area of the primary sensory cortex that corresponds to that specific area of the hand. And what happens when that electrical signal hits that area of the primary sensory cortex? What happens when it releases those neurotransmitters and excites that specific area of the primary sensory cortex? That's when the awareness of that stimuli happens. That's when you become aware of that light touch that's occurring on the brain. Not before that, but only you don't feel it until that information goes to that specific area of the primary sensory cortex. So if you were to open up the brain and have access to the primary sensory cortex, you could electrically stimulate all these different areas of the primary sensory cortex, and you would feel sensations from that specific area of the body. All right, and so this is a scenario, an example of a scenario that I'd like you guys to be able to deal with here. Here we have somebody walking over rocks, and they look like sharp rocks. It also looks like it's sunny out, and this kid, will say, is going barefoot. And so I want you to go through this scenario and talk about the sensory information that's being generated on the feet and where that sensory information goes to be integrated. Okay, specifically, I want you to talk about, here's the thalamus. I want you to tell me what happens when that sensory information hits the primary sensory cortex. Then that information goes over to the association area. What happens when it goes over to the association area? Okay, two things. And by the way, this awareness and then this applying meaning and deciding a response, this is all collectively referred to as integration. So the specific steps that we're looking at here are all part of integration. Okay, that's good for the parietal lobe. And then we have in the back of the brain, we have the occipital lobe. And not surprisingly, we have a visual cortex, and then we have a visual association area. Well, guess what? If this is the eye right there, and we have this this light information that's coming in, that information is going to travel back, and where's it going to go? It's going to go to the visual cortex. What happens when that information gets to the visual cortex? That's when you actually see. You don't see, these light waves don't get processed until that information hits the visual cortex. Now, what would happen if you had damage to the visual cortex? Say you hit the back of your head and you had damage to the visual cortex. You wouldn't be able to see. Your eyes might be working fine. Your eyes are okay. The information is traveling back here through the optic nerve and through other neurons. But since the visual cortex is damaged, that information is not going to be processed. You're not going to become aware of it. You're not going to be able to see. But if your visual cortex is fine, that's where you see, that's where you become aware of it, then the information goes to the visual association area. And what happens there? Well, that's where you actually give meaning to what you're seeing. Oh, shoot, there's a car coming at me, I want to get out of the way, that kind of thing. That's where you give meaning to it. So what would happen if there's damage to the association area? Would you be able to see? You would be able to see, you just wouldn't be able to give meaning to what you're seeing. And I had some students in the past that were interested in this, so I started doing a little bit of research here, but this has to do with facial recognition. And so here you can see back at the back of the brain, well, here's the eye, and this information travels back to the visual cortex, and that's where we actually see. But then with regards to facial recognition, there's kind of this triangle of nuclei here that are involved in facial recognition. And one of these, I don't have this described out too well, one of these is called the occipital facial area, and that's back in the occipital, in the visual association area. You also have this area called the fusiform face area. And this is actually part of the temporal lobe up there. And so all of these different areas are involved in facial recognition specifically. And I don't know if you remember this, when the Congresswoman Gabby Giffords from Arizona, I believe, got shot. And the bullet came through and it damaged some of these areas. And so she's had a really long, hard struggle to get back to where she needs to be, and you can watch that there. But these facial recognition areas were damaged, and so she was dealing with that, and dealing with she's able to see, but she wasn't able to put meaning to those faces that she was seeing. All right, so how does this visual information get to the brain? We'll talk about this a little bit with the eye, but basically, there's the eye, and on the back of the eye, there's photoreceptors that are located in the retina. And those photoreceptors are stimulated, and they travel via the optic nerves. Okay, so they travel via the optic nerve. There's an optic nerve, there's an optic nerve. And these optic nerves cross over at an area called the optic chiasma, which you have to know for the lab. And then it's basically the same neurons, it's just called something else. Then they become the optic tract. And so you have these neurons that are taking visual information via the optic tract. And where are they going? What's that area of the brain right there that they're going? That's the thalamus. Okay, so the thalamus receives this information, and then it sends it back to the occipital lobe, and specifically the visual cortex. And then after that, it goes to the visual association area. All right, and that's good for the cerebrum. And then lastly, I just want to finish off with this walnut-like structure at the back of the brain, and that's called the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is involved in motor control. It's involved in skeletal muscle movements. And so it receives input from a lot of different areas of the body that are involved with skeletal muscle control. There's some brainstem nuclei it receives information from, proprioceptors, okay, measuring stretch of the skeletal muscles and stretch of the joints. That information is taken to the cerebellum. And basically what the cerebellum does with all of this motor information is it coordinates the timing and execution of skeletal muscle movements. It allows for smooth, coordinated movements. Walking, texting, talking, all of this requires the cerebellum to be able to pull this off in a smooth, coordinated fashion. And, this is illustrated if you have damage to the cerebellum. If you have damage to the cerebellum, then you can have what's called ataxia. And that's a disturbance in the direction of voluntary movements. You have an abnormal gait. You have trouble controlling your walk. Or I guess more succinctly put, you have uncoordinated movements because you can't smooth out and coordinate this skeletal muscle movements. You misjudge distance. Okay, that type of thing. And this made me sad, but I thought I'd put it on just as an example of this. This isn't a video, but you can probably look up the video. It was this dog here has what's called cerebellar hypoplasia, basically missing part of the cerebellum. And if you watch this video, it's on the dodo here, you can see that this dog has ataxia. It's having trouble walking and coordinating its movements. This golden doodle. If we look at this picture here, the only thing that I want to point out here is that down here we have a proprioceptor in the skeletal muscles, and that sensory information goes to the spinal cord. And where does it go? It goes over there to the cerebellum. So this is just to illustrate that those proprioceptors are sending that information to the cerebellum to help coordinate that movement. And then another thing, if you were to take a sagittal section of the cerebellum, you have this area out here that's all gray matter, and then interior to that you have this white matter. And this white matter here is organized like a tree, and specifically they call it the arbor vitae, the tree of life. So that's the arbor vitae is this specific white matter that you find within the cerebellum, and it extends out, like so. And that's something that you have to know for the lab. Okay, good deal.